Thank you very much, Director of Ceremonies. Your Excellency, Atahiramadam Desalegn, Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Vice President of the Comoros and Vice President of Gambia, Your Excellency Carlos Lopez, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Your Excellency Dr. Papatunde Osodimehim, Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, Honorable Ministers, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, I wish to bring you greetings from the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Her Excellency Nkosazana Zuma, who is not able to be with you this morning, but has a lot of interest and follows the outcome of this meeting with a keen interest. Let me also thank our two co-organizers of this meeting, not just for this meeting, but for our cooperation in general, but also the value that this cooperation brings to our integration agenda, and also addressing the challenging needs of Africa. Listening to the two speakers, Carlos and Papatunde, one is very much tempted to speak out of the box, because this conference here, as Papatunde has just said now, is not just about looking back to where we have come from, but also looking to the future. And I think we should do it in the context, of course, lessons learned since 1994, when the first ICPD conference was held, but then also examine it within the context of what is happening globally, and from there also see those elements that as we develop common positions that Africa needs to internalize as areas of Africa's interests. But even within Africa, we need also to look at, as was said earlier on by Carlos, the regional context. And of course, needless to say, there are national applications of what we are talking. And even at national level, one needs also to look at what needs to be designed at, call it provincial level, but also individual level. What this means is that this is a highly complex subject, and that we cannot have one size fits all. But we can identify common issues that should form the basis of our post-2015 agenda globally, but also even at the national level, and those shared lessons that we can all work on together. But looking back, say, to 1994, and the agenda that was set forward as at that time, some of them like providing universal family planning, sexual and reproductive health services and reproductive rights, delivering gender equality, empowerment of women and equal access to education for girls, address to individual socio-economic impact of urbanization and migration, and supporting sustainable development and addressing environmental issues associated with population changes. The previous speakers have analyzed some of the positive developments out of this, and also where we haven't been right on the mark. An example is what Papatunde has told us, the question of giving, say, the girl child education, because it has impact First, on empowerment for the girl child to know her own rights, but also empowering them to be able to get means, if it is not just education, access to education, but education that empowers them to get employment that can also enable them to look after the child, but also be able to escape the social ills that you get in certain societies. And that's why we talked about the provincial aspects, but it's not in all, in every country. You do get certain regions where certain cultures would still continue to impede on the girl child. But some of the lessons that come out of it, it was hoped that Africa would have stabilized the population 20 years down the road. But statistics that have also been given this morning indicate, on the contrary, and what is also perhaps where Africa would be looking at with keen interest is this bulge of the youth, which is a double-edged sword. On one hand could be a ticking bomb, but on the other side could be an asset that Africa could use for its own socio-economic development. Hence, examples that are being given, as for instance, how China has developed using the democratic dividend, India, and so on. And now stepping out of the box. Since we're talking about population being at the center of development, since we're talking about the global common values that we should address under the post-2015 agenda, I think it's only appropriate for us to examine the global dynamics and how it is impacting on this very issue. As we talk about the aging world and the young world. But taking eyes off the population, we should also look at the issue of resource globally. I'm actually reminded when I was in high school, one of the essays I read was Malthus' theory, which predicted the doom and gloom come the year 2026, something of that nature. And one needs to stand to take a position where Malthus was standing at that position. He was probably looking at the technology that was in place at that time and the many facets of life. Is it possible that as we sit here, we could also be doing the same thing like Malthus did, where he predicted, but you can see that prediction is really coming out of sync with what is happening in the world. The very idea of talking about globally is to question the global economic architecture. Which will bring to focus the issue of industrialization, trade, use of resources, and so forth. And I think this point was captured very well by Carlos when he said, if you look at Africa today and the agenda we're developing, whether it is in our short-term strategic plan or 2063, the narrative has to change. Because the issue may not be so much, and this is out of the box. I beg for understanding, some who may disagree, bearing in mind that we need to understand that in structures, particularly in the low income, population is a challenge. We need to think about the size of the family that our family can take care of. But if you talk globally, is Africa's population 1 billion a challenge? I think the answer is not so much so. If today Africa were solidly integrated, if today Africa were adding value to the resources that we are exporting at very low value, if today the global architecture was equitable, perhaps that would not be as much of a challenge as it is today. And I think that's one area that we need to step out of the box and link the population to development continentally, whereas addressing at the family level and at the national level. The second point that I thought one would bring to focus is the quality of data, the analysis of the data. Statisticians will say, statistics never lie. But sometimes we analyze these statistics to reach a certain conclusions, to come with development models that would suit the analysis that the statistics have given. I think for Africa, we really need, and we want to thank ECA for putting this item as a priority for us to be able to get the quality data so that the analysis can then inform policy, can inform action. And I think this is not an issue that ECA can do on its own. It's an issue that we all have to do because we have to organize it from village level to national level for us to get quality data that can help us. Having said that, I think it's only fair to say, as we talk of post-2015 agenda, the temptation, in my view, is that we may end up with a basket where everything is in. We need then to identify the key drivers of economic change and design policies around that, because having sat in this room 2-3 times where we've been talking about the post-2015 agenda, one can gain an impression that we may end up with everything being a priority. If we then identify those key priority areas, it is easy for us then to concentrate the resources on those areas for us to have impact on society. Needless to mention, it has been said Africa is lagging behind. And so let's focus on those key areas. And that's why if you look at the agenda that we have developed in the continent, it's focusing on some key areas just to highlight. For instance, we are talking today, our priority should be science and technology in Africa. That doesn't mean we ignore access to education. In fact, far from it, we should focus on that. But this is the goal that is in MDG. So we must now change this kind of goals so that we address really the key areas that would have impact on the continent. We are talking about industrialization. We are talking about enhancing intra-African trade. We are talking about health so that we can have access, that we can improve the quality of the population so that they can contribute to socio-economic growth. And so the whole idea for us as we gather here, and the real outcome of this meeting, is not to add on the list of priorities, but to identify the key that are unique to Africa, and the areas that Africa can push as a priority. Not, for instance, as Carlos was saying, going for reduction of poverty, but for instance, insist that we must go for prosperity. What would that mean? It will mean that we must industrialize. We must have science and technology. And we must see a really qualitative change to the lives of Africa, where Africa will start to see what Carlos was saying, a sustainable growth that is come here to stay. And so it's on that basis that we want to thank you, the honorable ministers, distinguished delegates that have come in large numbers, because these are real issues, real challenges that face our continent as we develop a common agenda within our continent and for future. And thank you for your kind attention.